At 3 a.m., my wife's brother walked in drunk and drove a screwdriver into my shoulder. I felt the warmth of blood as my wife laughed. "You're so dramatic." Trembling, I sent an SOS before everything went dark. What followed left the courtroom silent. The judge's face said it all. They say every marriage has a breaking point. That moment when you realize you've been sleeping next to a stranger who happens to know your Netflix password. Mine came with a screwdriver at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, because apparently even my trauma couldn't be bothered to happen on a weekend when I had time to process it properly. The living room smelled like a frat house had a baby with a microwave fire, stale beer, burned popcorn that had been nuked into oblivion about 45 minutes earlier, and what I can only describe as the distinct aroma of bad decisions marinating in regret. My wife Miranda was doing her usual evening ritual, which consisted of sprawling across our secondhand couch like a Roman emperor at a discount furniture store, scrolling through TikTok with the kind of dedication most people reserve for actual jobs. The blue light from her phone lit up her face in a way that would have been almost ethereal if she wasn't watching someone do a dance about their toxic relationship while literally living in one. Then Tyler stumbled in through the front door, and I knew immediately that this Tuesday was about to get a whole lot more interesting, and not in the found $20 in your jacket kind of way. More like the surprise root canal performed by a guy who's definitely not a dentist variety. Miranda's brother Tyler was drunk enough to think gravity was more of a suggestion than a law of physics, zigzagging through our living room like he was trying to dodge invisible laser beams. His eyes had that glazed-over quality that screamed, "I made poor choices at every bar between here and wherever the hell I started." And his breath could have probably stripped paint off the walls if we'd had the budget to paint them in the first place. "Leo," he slurred, pointing at me with the kind of aggressive finger-jabbing that drunk people think makes them look authoritative, but really just makes them look like they're conducting an invisible orchestra of bad ideas. "We need to talk about respect, man. RESPECT. You know that song? Aretha Franklin? Respect." I was sitting in my recliner, the one piece of furniture in this house that was actually mine, that Miranda hadn't claimed as community property in the ongoing territorial dispute that was our marriage. I had a beer in one hand, lukewarm and disappointing, kind of like my life choices. "Tyler, it's 3 in the morning. How about we pencil in this respect conversation for never o'clock?" But Tyler wasn't hearing me. He never did. In the 2 years I'd been married to his sister, I'd learned that the Donahue family had a spectacular talent for selective hearing, particularly when it came to anything that resembled common sense or basic human decency. "You think you're better than us," he continued, swaying like a tree in a hurricane, "with your fancy government job and your briefcase and your stupid face." My stupid face. That was new. I'd been called a lot of things by my in-laws. Boring, uptight, that guy Miranda settled for. But stupid face was definitely a creative addition to the greatest hits collection. "Tyler, you're drunk. Go sleep it off in the guest room. We'll discuss my offensive facial features when you're sober, which based on current trends should be sometime around the next solar eclipse." That's when Miranda finally looked up from her phone, and I swear I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not concern, not embarrassment. More like the look you get when you're watching a reality TV show and you're waiting for someone to flip a table. Entertainment. She was entertained. "Leo, just hear him out," she said, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness she used whenever she wanted to seem reasonable while being completely unreasonable. "He's had a rough day." A rough day? Tyler had rough days the way other people had breakfast, daily and with minimal variation. But sure, let's all gather around and validate his feelings while he's standing in my living room at 3 in the morning, swaying like a drunk metronome. I sighed and put my beer down on the side table, preparing to engage in what I assumed would be another round of let's all pretend Tyler's behavior is normal and Leo's the problem. But Tyler had other plans. He lurched toward the kitchen, and for a moment I thought maybe he was going to get some water, sober up a little, prove me wrong about the Donahue family's collective inability to make good decisions. Nope. He grabbed something off the counter. I couldn't see what in the dim light, and came back wielding it like Excalibur if Excalibur had been purchased at a hardware store clearance sale. It was a Phillips head screwdriver, the one I'd been using earlier to fix the wobbly kitchen chair that nobody in this house seemed capable of sitting in without making it worse. "You need to learn," Tyler announced, and honestly, the sentence just kind of ended there, like his drunk brain couldn't quite figure out what I needed to learn or how a screwdriver factored into this educational opportunity. I stood up, hands raised in the universal gesture of, let's all calm down and not do anything that'll require a police report. Tyler, put that down before you hurt yourself, man. Come on. But he didn't put it down. He took a step forward, stumbled, and in what I can only describe as the world's worst magic trick, the screwdriver that had been in his hand was suddenly in my shoulder. The pain hit like someone had plugged me directly into a wall socket, electric and immediate, and completely unwelcome. Warmth bloomed across my shirt, spreading like a cheap lava lamp someone had shaken too hard, dark and wet, and absolutely not the kind of accessory I wanted to be wearing at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday. I looked down at the screwdriver sticking out of my shoulder like the world's worst participatory art installation, then up at Tyler, who was staring at his hand like he couldn't quite figure out how it had betrayed him like this. Then I looked at Miranda, because surely my wife would react with some kind of appropriate horror or concern or basic human empathy. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a shocked, oh my God, what just happened laugh. A genuine, amused laugh, like Tyler had just told a pretty good joke instead of literally stabbing her husband. You're so dramatic, Leo, she said, shaking her head with a little smile that made something inside me break in a way that had nothing to do with the screwdriver currently exploring my shoulder muscle. That's when I realized, with perfect clarity despite the blood loss and the pain and the general what-the-hell-ness of the situation, that I wasn't in a marriage. I was in a low-budget horror comedy where I was the only one who didn't know I was the victim. As my legs decided they were done with this whole standing thing, and I hit the floor with all the grace of a sack of potatoes, I did what any self-respecting man with a federal security clearance and a growing collection of terrible life decisions would do. I pulled my phone out of my pocket with my good arm, found the contact that didn't have a name, just a series of numbers that didn't show up on phone bills or data requests or anywhere the normal world could see, and I typed 3 letters, SOS. The last thing I saw before the world went black was Miranda's face, still smiling, still scrolling through TikTok, the blue light making her look like a beautiful, terrible ghost. Then nothing. 2 weeks before the Screwdriver Olympics turned my shoulder into a pincushion, family life looked what the Donahue clan would call normal, which is kind of like calling a dumpster fire atmospheric lighting. It was a Saturday afternoon, and we were having one of those mandatory family barbecues that Miranda's parents hosted every month like clockwork, because apparently nothing says quality time like forcing people who barely tolerate each other to stand around a grill pretending processed meat products are the foundation of meaningful relationships. Miranda's parents, Doug and Cheryl, lived in one of those suburban houses that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd seen a picture of the American dream once and decided to recreate it using only beige paint and aggressive landscaping. Their backyard was Doug's pride and joy, complete with a deck he'd built himself that was only slightly crooked, a gas grill that cost more than my first car, and enough lawn ornaments to start a garden gnome civilization. I was standing by the cooler, contemplating whether my 3rd beer was going to make this experience more tolerable or just make me need to pee during one of Doug's stories about his glory days selling timeshares in Florida, when Tyler rolled up like he was arriving at a red carpet event instead of his parents' backyard. He had that swagger that guys get when they've convinced themselves they're winning at life despite all evidence to the contrary. And he was wearing a polo shirt with the logo of the used car dealership, where he worked emblazoned on the chest like it was Gucci. The man of the hour, Doug announced, because apparently Tyler showing up to his own parents' house warranted a parade. Come here, son, let me get you a burger. You want cheese? Of course you want cheese. Tyler always wants cheese. Miranda appeared at my elbow, smelling like the expensive perfume she bought with our joint credit card, without consulting the joint part of that arrangement. Isn't it nice having everyone together? She said, and I couldn't tell if she was being sincere or if this was some kind of test I was destined to fail. It's something, I replied, which was about as enthusiastic as I could manage while watching Tyler accept his cheeseburger like he'd just won a Nobel Prize for showing up. The afternoon proceeded with all the predictable beats of a Donahue family gathering. Tyler held court in the center of the deck, surrounded by Miranda's Uncle Frank, her cousin Jessica, and a couple of neighbors who'd wandered over because apparently free hot dogs override the instinct to avoid awkward family dynamics. He was in the middle of what I'd started mentally cataloging as the tales of Tyler, which were stories that always somehow made him look like a combination of a business genius and a misunderstood hero. So this couple comes in, right? Tyler was saying, gesturing with his beer bottle like a professor with a pointer. And they're looking at this 2015 Honda Civic. Nothing special, but they're acting like I'm trying to sell them a lemon. I look the guy dead in the eye and I say, "Sir, this car has one owner, clean history, and runs like a dream. You're not going to find a better deal in this city." Uncle Frank, who had the critical thinking skills of a decorative throw pillow, nodded enthusiastically. That's salesmanship right there. You tell him, Tyler. Sold it same day. Tyler concluded triumphantly. Boom. 3 cars this week. I'm telling you, I've got the touch. 3 cars. He'd sold 3 used cars and was acting like he'd personally negotiated world peace. I took a long drink of my beer and tried to remember why I'd married into this family. But honestly, the reasons were getting hazier by the minute. That's when Cheryl decided it was time to spread the love around. Leo, honey, you're being so quiet over there, she called out, and I felt everyone's attention shift to me like spotlights finding the one person at a party who doesn't want to be seen. Tell everyone about your work. You're still at that little government job, right? That little government job. The way she said it made it sound like I was a hall monitor at an elementary school, filing incident reports about kids who ran in the corridors. The condescension was so thick you could spread it on toast. Yeah, still there, I said, aiming for casual, but probably landing somewhere around guy who's given up. What is it you do exactly? Jessica asked, and I could tell from her tone that this wasn't genuine curiosity, but more like when people ask, "How are you?" and don't actually want to hear about your irritable bowel syndrome. This was always the tricky part. My actual job was senior analyst in the Federal Threat Assessment Division, which was a fancy way of saying I spent my days identifying potential security risks, tracking terrorism financing networks, and occasionally briefing people with enough clearance that they had to leave their phones in a locker before entering the room. I'd helped dismantle 2 domestic extremist cells in the past year alone, and I had security clearance that meant I couldn't even tell Miranda half of what I did on any given Tuesday. But explaining that to the Donahue family was like trying to explain quantum physics to a golden retriever. Theoretically possible, but ultimately pointless and frustrating for everyone involved. I do analysis for a federal agency, I said, which was vague enough to be true and boring enough to hopefully end the conversation. Doug laughed, flipping a burger with the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that suggested he was taking out some unspoken frustration on the meat. Analysis. That's one of those desk jobs where you push papers around, right? Thank God Tyler got the sales gene in the family. Can't teach that kind of charisma. The sales gene. As if being able to convince people to overpay for cars with questionable maintenance histories was some kind of hereditary superpower. Tyler grinned at me, and there was something in that grin that made my teeth ache. Nothing wrong with a stable job, Leo. Not everyone's cut out for the fast pace of commission-based work. Takes a certain kind of person, you know? What he meant was, takes someone who's not a boring loser like you. Absolutely, I said, smiling in a way that I hoped looked agreeable, but probably looked more like I was digesting something that had gone bad. Not everyone can handle the pressure of selling 3 cars in a week. The sarcasm went right over his head, which wasn't surprising. Tyler's relationship with sarcasm was like a fish's relationship with bicycle repair, non-existent and slightly confusing. Miranda squeezed my arm, which was her signal for play nice, as if I was the one being difficult in this scenario. I looked at her perfect smile and her perfect hair and her perfectly cultivated ability to ignore anything uncomfortable, and wondered when exactly she decided that throwing me under the bus was an acceptable form of family entertainment. Uncle Frank launched into a story about his son who was apparently killing it in pharmaceutical sales, and I zoned out, watching a bird pick at some dropped potato salad near the fence. That bird had more dignity than I did right now, and it was literally eating garbage. The afternoon dragged on with all the speed of continental drift. Tyler told more stories, each one somehow more self-aggrandizing than the last. Doug made jokes about government workers being lazy. Cheryl kept asking if I wanted more food in that tone that suggested she thought I looked too thin, which I think was her way of saying I looked like I wasn't thriving. Jessica talked about her CrossFit routine with the intensity of someone who'd found religion at a gym. And me? I stood there drinking lukewarm beer, nodding at appropriate intervals, and thinking about the classified briefing I'd attended on Thursday about an emerging threat network that had been on my radar for 6 months. About how I'd connected 3 seemingly unrelated financial transactions that led to identifying a weapons procurement cell. About how my little government job had probably prevented something terrible from happening, and nobody here would ever know or care. Because in the Donahue family, I wasn't Leo Grant, senior threat analyst. I was just Leo, Miranda's husband with the boring desk job, who couldn't sell a car to save his life. Tyler raised his beer bottle. "To family," he announced. Everyone raised their bottles and cans. "To family," they echoed. I raised mine too, because what else was I going to do? But as I took that drink, I thought about how family was supposed to be the people who had your back, not the people who casually stabbed you in it with backhanded compliments and dismissive comments. 2 weeks later, Tyler would use an actual screwdriver instead of words. But honestly, the damage had already been done. So let's rewind back to that magical Tuesday night when my marriage officially jumped the shark, except instead of water skis, there was a screwdriver, and instead of a shark, there was just crushing disappointment wrapped in a drunk package named Tyler. The thing about violence is that it never announces itself with proper fanfare. There's no ominous music, no slow-motion warning. Just 1 minute you're existing in your living room, and the next minute you're starring in your own medical emergency. Tyler had been ranting for what felt like 17 hours, but was probably closer to 5 minutes, going on and on about respect and family values, and how I didn't understand what it meant to be a Donahue. Which honestly, thank God for small mercies, because if being a Donahue meant showing up drunk at 3 in the morning to deliver speeches that would make a TED Talk look coherent, I was perfectly happy being a Grant. "You sit there in your chair like you're better than everyone," he was saying, and his words were doing that thing drunk people's words do where they kind of blur together like someone's making a smoothie out of syllables. "With your government job and your fancy briefcase and your uppity attitude." Uppity. That was a new one. I'd graduated from having a stupid face to having an uppity attitude, which I guess was character development of a sort, even if it was the kind of development that nobody asked for and everyone regretted. I was still in my recliner, the one sanctuary I had in this house that smelled like Miranda's vanilla candles and broken dreams, trying to calculate exactly how much longer I had to endure this before Tyler either passed out or got bored and stumbled home to whatever hole he'd crawled out of. Miranda was still on the couch, her phone casting that blue glow on her face that made her look like a beautiful ghost haunting our marriage, which was actually pretty accurate when I thought about it. "Tyler," I said, going for reasonable because I'm an idiot who still thought reason had any place in this conversation. "It's 3 in the morning. I have work tomorrow. You're drunk. How about we table this discussion until you're sober enough to remember your own middle name?" "Don't patronize me," he slurred, which was rich coming from a guy who could barely pronounce patronize. "You think you're so smart with your big words and your analysis job. What do you even analyze, huh? Spreadsheets? Numbers? Must be real exciting pushing papers while I'm out there closing deals." There it was again, the constant comparison between his used car sales and my federal job, as if they were even in the same universe. It was like comparing a participation trophy to an Olympic medal and insisting they were equivalent because they were both shiny. But I learned over the past 2 years that trying to explain the actual importance of national security threat assessment to someone who thought analysis meant counting things was about as productive as teaching a goldfish calculus. "Sure, Tyler. Papers. That's exactly what I do. I push papers around all day, and sometimes I collate them really well, and everyone applauds." The sarcasm was dripping off my words like honey off a spoon, thick and obvious. But Tyler's sarcasm detector had left the building around the same time his sobriety did. He took a step toward me, wobbling like a Jenga tower someone had been playing with too aggressively. And that's when I noticed he was clenching and unclenching his fists like he was practicing for a fight scene in a movie where the budget didn't cover a fight choreographer. "You need to show some respect, man. We're family. Hard to respect someone who loses chess to a toaster," I said. And okay, maybe that wasn't my finest moment in terms of de-escalation, but in my defense, it was 3 in the morning, I was tired, and Tyler had actually lost a chess game to an electronic chess set at last Christmas that was designed for children aged 8 and up. It was a sore subject, apparently, because his face did this thing where it went from drunk confused to drunk angry, which is never a good transition. What did you just say? He lurched toward the kitchen, and I thought maybe he was going to get some water, prove me wrong about his ability to make good decisions, maybe even apologize for barging in here like a wrecking ball with boundary issues. Instead, he grabbed something off the counter. I couldn't see what in the dim lighting because Miranda had this thing about mood lighting that meant our house was perpetually lit like a sad nightclub, and came back holding my Phillips head screwdriver like it was a sword, and he was some kind of drunk knight fighting for the honor of used car salesmen everywhere. Tyler, what are you doing? I asked, and I could hear the edge in my voice now. That little flutter of concern that happens when you realize a situation has gone from annoying to potentially dangerous. Put that down before someone gets hurt. You need to learn, he announced, wielding the screwdriver with all the coordination of a baby giraffe trying to use chopsticks. You need to learn that you can't just disrespect family and get away with it. I stood up from my recliner, hands raised in what I hoped was a calming gesture, but probably looked more like I was trying to surrender to a particularly aggressive traffic cop. Tyler, come on, man. This is insane. Just put it down and go sleep it off. We can talk about this tomorrow when you're not drunk off your ass. But he wasn't listening. He never was. The Donahue family had this spectacular talent for selective hearing, and right now Tyler's hearing was selecting only the voices in his head that told him this was a reasonable course of action. He took another step forward, stumbled over absolutely nothing because drunk people can trip over flat surfaces, and that's when physics and poor decision-making collided in the worst possible way. 1 second the screwdriver was in his hand, pointed vaguely in my direction like he was trying to make a point. The next second he was falling forward, and the screwdriver was doing that thing where objects in motion tend to stay in motion, and I was the object in its path. The pain was immediate and spectacular, like someone had lit a sparkler inside my shoulder and then decided to really commit to the bit. I looked down and saw the Phillips head buried in my flesh like some kind of terrible garden sculpture, and my shirt was already starting to bloom with blood, dark and wet, and spreading faster than I would have liked. It was warm, which was weird. I'd always imagined getting stabbed would feel cold, but it was warm like bathwater, like my body was trying to comfort me while simultaneously betraying me. Oh, I said, because apparently when you get stabbed your brain short-circuits, and all you can manage is monosyllables. Oh, that's not good. Tyler was staring at his hand like it belonged to someone else, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and what might have been the beginning of regret if he'd been sober enough to process complex emotions. I didn't. I wasn't. You moved. I moved. Classic Tyler logic. When in doubt, blame the victim. I looked over at Miranda, because surely my wife of 2 years would react with appropriate horror. Surely she'd jump up, call 911, show some indication that she understood her husband had just been stabbed by her brother in their living room at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday. She laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh or a shocked laugh. It was genuine amusement, like she'd just watched a funny cat video instead of witnessing an actual assault. You're so dramatic, Leo, she said, not even putting down her phone. It's just a scratch. Don't be such a baby about it. Just a scratch. I had a screwdriver sticking out of my shoulder like a morbid hood ornament, and she was calling it a scratch. That's when everything clicked into place with perfect, horrible clarity. I wasn't in a marriage. I was in a hostage situation with better furniture and shared streaming accounts. This wasn't a relationship. It was a low-budget horror comedy where I was the punchline and nobody had bothered to tell me. My legs decided they were done with this whole situation and gave out, sending me to the floor with all the grace of a dropped puppet. The pain in my shoulder was competing with the pain in my chest, the emotional kind that comes from realizing the person you married would rather film your suffering than stop it. I managed to pull my phone out of my pocket with my good arm, the one that didn't have hardware embedded in it. My fingers found the contact that didn't have a name, just a string of numbers that routed through servers that didn't officially exist. 3 letters, SOS. The phone buzzed back almost immediately, signal received. And then the world started doing that thing where it got fuzzy around the edges, like someone was slowly turning down the brightness settings on reality. I could hear Miranda saying something, her voice distant and distorted, and Tyler was muttering about how this wasn't his fault, and somewhere in the background there might have been sirens or maybe that was just my blood pressure doing interpretive dance. The last coherent thought I had before everything went black was, at least I won't have to go to next month's barbecue. Then nothing. I woke up to the smell of antiseptic and irony, which is apparently what heaven smells like if heaven is actually a circle of hell specifically designed for people who've made terrible life choices. My shoulder felt like someone had replaced it with a bag of angry hornets, and there was this persistent beeping sound that I eventually realized was a heart monitor and not, as I'd initially thought, the world's most annoying alarm clock telling me I was late for my own tragedy. The ceiling tiles were that particular shade of institutional off-white that's supposed to be calming, but actually just makes you think about how many people have stared at these same tiles while contemplating their mortality. I counted 17 tiles before my eyes could focus enough to take in the rest of my surroundings. Hospital room. Generic edition, complete with those thin blankets that are somehow both scratchy and useless. A TV mounted on the wall playing what looked like a rerun of a home improvement show, and enough medical equipment to make me wonder if I'd been stabbed or if they were planning to launch me into space. My right shoulder was bandaged so thoroughly, it looked like someone had gotten overly enthusiastic with gauze and decided to just commit to the bit. There was an IV in my left arm pumping what I assumed was either pain medication or liquid regret, possibly both. And sitting in the chair next to my bed, looking like she'd stepped out of a Concerned Wife catalog, was Miranda. She was wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun that had probably taken 20 minutes to look that casually perfect, and she was holding my hand with both of hers like she was afraid I might float away if she let go. The audacity of it all was actually impressive. This woman had watched her brother stab me and then laughed about it, and now here she was playing the role of devoted spouse with the kind of commitment most people reserve for their Oscar campaigns. "Leo," she said softly when she noticed my eyes were open, and there were actual tears on her cheeks, which was either genuine emotion or she'd gotten really good at method acting. "Oh, thank God, you're awake." I was so worried. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like I'd been gargling sand and disappointment, so what came out was more of a croak than actual words. She immediately reached for a cup of water on the bedside table, complete with one of those bendable straws that hospitals use, because apparently when you're injured they assume you've also forgotten how to drink like a normal human being. "Here, take it slow," she coaxed, holding the straw to my lips like I was a toddler learning about hydration for the first time. The water tasted like it had been filtered through someone's hope for a better tomorrow, bland and vaguely disappointing, but my throat appreciated it anyway. "What happened?" I managed to rasp out, even though I remembered exactly what happened. Sometimes you ask questions you know the answers to see if the other person will lie to your face, and I had a feeling Miranda was about to put on a performance that would make Shakespeare weep. She squeezed my hand tighter, and I could feel her wedding ring pressing into my palm. That little circle of metal that was supposed to symbolize eternal love, but mostly just symbolized that we'd made a legally binding mistake at a garden ceremony 2 years ago. "You tripped, honey," she said, her voice dripping with concern that felt about as genuine as a $3 bill. "You were getting up from your recliner, and you lost your balance and fell on the screwdriver Tyler had left on the side table. It was a terrible accident. A terrible accident." She was really going with that story. I'd been stabbed by her drunk brother who'd been waving the screwdriver around like a deranged conductor, and she was spinning it like I'd somehow managed to impale myself through sheer clumsiness. The gaslighting was so blatant, it was almost impressive, like watching someone try to convince you that the sky is green while you're standing outside on a clear day. "Tyler feels awful about it," she continued, and her eyes were doing that thing where they got big and sincere looking, like a puppy that had just chewed up your favorite shoes and was trying to apologize through sheer cuteness. "He's beside himself, Leo. He didn't mean to leave the screwdriver there. He was just trying to help fix the chair earlier and forgot about it. You know how he is." Oh, I knew how he was. I knew exactly how he was. Drunk, aggressive, and apparently now capable of retroactive tool placement according to Miranda's creative revision of history. The fact that she expected me to believe this fairy tale was almost more insulting than the actual stabbing. A nurse came in, clipboard in hand, wearing scrubs covered in little cartoon cats that seemed wildly inappropriate for the situation, but somehow perfectly captured the absurdity of my life. She was maybe 50, with the kind of face that suggested she'd seen every variety of human stupidity and was no longer surprised by any of it. "Mr. Grant, good to see you're awake," she said, checking the monitors with practiced efficiency. I'm Deborah. How's your pain level on a scale of 1 to 10? Somewhere between I've made poor life choices and I should have married literally anyone else, I said, and Deborah's mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. So about a 7, she interpreted, and I nodded because sure, 7 worked if we were only counting physical pain and ignoring the existential crisis happening in my soul. She made some notes, adjusted my 4, and gave Miranda a look that I couldn't quite interpret but felt like it contained volumes of judgment. The doctor will be by in about an hour to check on you. You're very lucky. The screwdriver missed all the major arteries and nerves. You'll need physical therapy, but you should make a full recovery. Lucky. Sure. I felt super lucky lying here with a stabbed shoulder and a wife who was auditioning for a role in a psychological thriller where she played the villain who thought she was the hero. After Deborah left, Miranda leaned in closer, and I could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral that I used to like, but now just smelled like betrayal with notes of jasmine. The police might want to talk to you, she said quietly. Just tell them what happened, okay? That you tripped. It's the truth. It wasn't the truth. It was so far from the truth that the truth would need a telescope to see it. But Miranda was looking at me with those eyes that used to make me forget my own name, and I realized she actually believed I'd go along with this. She thought I'd lie for her family, protect Tyler from the consequences of his actions, swallow this ridiculous story, and let it digest into our relationship like everything else I'd swallowed over the past 2 years. Sure, I said, my voice flat. Whatever you say. She smiled, relieved, and kissed my forehead like I was a child who'd finally agreed to eat his vegetables. I'm going to get some coffee. Do you need anything? I'm good. I lied, because what I actually needed was a time machine and better judgment, but hospital vending machines don't usually stock those. The second she left the room, I reached for my phone on the bedside table with my good arm. My shoulder screamed in protest at the movement, but I ignored it because pain was temporary and federal documentation was forever. I found the secure line in my contacts, not the SOS number I'd used last night, but the official internal reporting line that connected to our division's incident desk. It rang twice before someone picked up. Federal Threat Assessment Division, Incident Desk, this is Agent Morrison. Morrison, this is Leo Grant, Employee ID TAS, 4472, Threat Assessment Division. My voice was steadier than I felt, probably thanks to whatever they had dripping into my 4. I'm calling to report an assault on a federal employee and to activate duress protocol under Section 7 of the Employee Protection Guidelines. There was a pause, the sound of typing. Grant, Leo, Senior Analyst. Confirmed. What's the nature of the incident? I was assaulted in my home by a family member at approximately 0300 hours on October 17th. I'm currently at County General Hospital, room 412. I activated emergency protocol via the SOS system during the incident. There was a witness present who was attempting to coerce me into providing false statements to local law enforcement. More typing. Copy that. Did you sustain injuries requiring medical intervention? Stabbing wound to the right shoulder. Treated and stabilized. I kept my voice professional, clinical, because this was business now. This wasn't about hurt feelings or betrayal. This was about the fact that someone had assaulted a federal employee, and there were protocols for that, procedures that existed specifically to protect people like me from people like Tyler. Understood. I'm flagging this for immediate review. You should expect a visit from legal counsel within the next 12 to 24 hours. Do you feel you're in immediate danger? I looked at the door where Miranda had exited, thought about Tyler probably sleeping off his hangover somewhere, thought about the whole Donahue family and their casual cruelty disguised as jokes, and their complete inability to take responsibility for anything ever. No immediate danger, but I prefer to activate the documentation protocol. Done. Everything from this point forward is on the record, Grant. Is there anything else you need right now? Yeah, I said, settling back into the pillows with a grim smile. Send someone who's really good at calling bullshit, because my wife is about to serve up a whole buffet of it. Copy that. Hang tight. And Grant, you did the right thing. I hung up just as Miranda came back with her coffee, smiling like everything was fine, like we were just a normal couple dealing with a weird accident instead of what we actually were, a train wreck in slow motion, finally documented in federal records. Who were you talking to? She asked, sitting back down in her chair. Work, I said. Just letting them know I'll be out for a few days. She nodded, satisfied, probably already planning how she'd spin this story at the next family barbecue. She had no idea I'd just thrown a grenade into her narrative. And honestly, I couldn't wait to watch it explode. The next morning arrived with all the subtlety of a marching band at a funeral, and I woke up to find that hospital breakfast was exactly as appetizing as you'd expect from food prepared by people who view edible as an aspirational goal rather than a baseline requirement. Scrambled eggs that had the texture of something that had given up on life, toast that could double as a roofing material, and coffee that tasted like someone had whispered the word bean near hot water and called it a day. I was halfway through choking down this culinary hate crime when there was a knock on my door, professional, efficient, the kind of knock that meant business. The woman who walked in was not messing around. She was maybe 35, Indian American, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my car and fit like it had been engineered by NASA scientists who specialized in looking intimidating. Her hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it could have been classified as a weapon, and she was carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it contained either very important documents or the souls of lawyers who'd disappointed her. She had the kind of presence that made you sit up straighter automatically, even if you had a stabbed shoulder and were wearing a hospital gown that kept trying to show everyone your business. "Mr. Grant," she said, not asking, just stating facts as she closed the door behind her with the kind of deliberate care that suggested she was already building a case in her head. "I'm Amira Patel, legal counsel for the Federal Threat Assessment Division. We need to talk." "No, how are you feeling?" "No, sorry about the whole getting stabbed thing." No small talk whatsoever. Just straight to business like she was here to perform surgery, except the surgery was on my legal situation and she didn't need anesthesia because she was just that efficient. I immediately liked her more than I'd liked anyone in the past 48 hours. "Ms. Patel," I said, trying to sit up straighter and immediately regretting it when my shoulder reminded me that movement was a privilege, not a right. "Thanks for coming." She pulled up a chair, set her briefcase on the bed with the kind of precision that suggested she'd measured the exact center of the mattress, and opened it to reveal folders that were color-coded and tabbed like she'd gone to war with the concept of disorganization and won. "Your SOS activation triggered an automatic incident report," she said, pulling out a document that had more official-looking stamps on it than a passport belonging to an international spy. Time-stamped, encrypted, authenticated, and routed through federal security protocols. The moment you sent that message, everything became part of the federal record. She slid the document across to me, and I could see my own SOS message there, time-stamped at 3 hours, 14 minutes, and 22 seconds, along with what looked like a complete log of every text, call, and digital interaction I'd had in the hours before and after the stabbing. It was simultaneously comforting and slightly terrifying to see how thoroughly my life had been documented. "This incident qualifies under Section 7 of the Federal Employee Protection Act," Amira continued, flipping to another tab with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times and was mildly annoyed she had to do it 1,001. "Assault on a federal employee, particularly one with your clearance level, moves this case into federal jurisdiction. Local law enforcement has been notified, but we're taking point on the investigation." Federal jurisdiction, I repeated, and I could feel a smile tugging at my lips despite the pain meds making everything slightly fuzzy. "So what you're saying is that my brother-in-law stabbed a federal employee and triggered protocols that he doesn't even know exist?" "That is precisely what I'm saying." Amira's expression didn't change, but I swear I saw the tiniest flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, like she was a chess player who'd just realized her opponent had walked into a checkmate 3 moves ago. "Your wife's statement to hospital staff that you tripped has been documented. Her attempt to influence your statement to law enforcement has been noted. Her brother's blood alcohol level from last night has been obtained through proper channels. Everything is on record." She pulled out another document, this one with a photo paper clipped to the top, and I realized it was a picture of my shoulder taken in the ER, the screwdriver still embedded, the wound trajectory clearly visible, blood and all. It was the kind of photo that made "tripped and fell" look like the dumbest lie ever told by someone who thought other people were idiots. Forensic analysis of the wound pattern indicates forceful penetration consistent with a deliberate stabbing motion, not a fall, Amira said, her voice as clinical as a medical examiner's, which was probably intentional. The angle, depth, and location are inconsistent with any scenario in which you could have accidentally impaled yourself. To put it in layman's terms, Mr. Grant, physics is not on your wife's side. God, I loved federal documentation. It was like bringing a tank to a knife fight, except in this case, it was bringing actual evidence to a gaslighting competition. There's more, Amira said, and she pulled out her phone, tapped something, and turned the screen toward me. It was a Facebook post from what looked like a local law firm's page, one of those injury lawyer advertisements that carpet bomb social media with smiling faces and promises of maximum compensation. Except this one had a familiar face in the background of their office photo, slick back hair, too much teeth in his smile, wearing a suit that screamed, "I got this at a going out of business sale, and I'm very proud of it." Rick Blanton, Esquire, Amira said, and the way she said Esquire made it sound like a communicable disease. Billboard lawyer, 3.2 stars on Google reviews, specializes in personal injury cases, and apparently has never met a lost cause he wouldn't take on if the check clears. Your wife's family retained him this morning. Of course they did. I muttered, looking at Rick Blanton's publicity photo where he was pointing at the camera like Uncle Sam, except Uncle Sam had made some poor grooming choices and shopped exclusively at Men's Warehouse during clearance events. Let me guess, they're going with the Leo's unstable and did this to himself for attention defense. Amira's eyebrow raised exactly 1 millimeter, which I was learning was her version of dramatic surprise. You're familiar with their strategy? I've been married to Miranda for 2 years. The Donahue family playbook has exactly 3 plays: deny, deflect, and blame someone else. Usually me. I gestured at the folders spread across my bed. I'm guessing Rick Blanton is about to have a very bad day when he realizes he's up against federal prosecutors instead of a local judge who might have gone to high school with Tyler. Mr. Blanton is going to have several bad days, Amira said, and this time there was definitely satisfaction in her voice, the kind of professional joy that lawyers get when they know they're about to educate someone on why you don't bring a butter knife to a gunfight. His clients are operating under the impression that this is a he-said-she-said domestic situation that will be resolved in local family court. They are incorrect. She pulled out yet another document. Seriously, her briefcase was like Mary Poppins' bag except instead of lamps and coat racks, it was full of legal ammunition, and slid it across to me. This is a preliminary restraining order against Tyler Donahue, effective immediately. He's not allowed within 500 feet of you, your workplace, or any federal facility. Violation of this order while a federal investigation is ongoing carries a minimum 2-year sentence. 500 feet. That was beautiful. That meant no more surprise visits, no more drunk rants, no more family barbecues where Tyler held court like a discount philosopher king while I stood there drinking lukewarm beer and contemplating my life choices. The preliminary hearing is scheduled for next week, Amira continued, flipping to a calendar in her briefcase that was color-coded so thoroughly it looked like a rainbow had been organized into submission. You'll need to provide testimony. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case will meet with you beforehand to prepare. In the meantime, you're on administrative leave with full pay, and we've arranged for security at your residence if you choose to return there. If I choose to return there, I repeated. You think I might not? Amira closed her briefcase with a definitive click that sounded like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Mr. Grant, your wife watched her brother stab you, and then laughed. She's currently attempting to gaslight you into covering for him, while simultaneously hiring a lawyer to paint you as mentally unstable. I think returning to that residence would be a poor decision, but that's your choice to make. What's not a choice is whether this case proceeds. Federal jurisdiction is not optional. She stood up, smoothed her suit jacket, and handed me a business card that was so professionally printed it probably cost more per card than most people's lunch. My direct number is on there. Call me if your wife or her family contacts you, if you're approached by Rick Blanton or any other attorney not cleared through our office, or if you feel unsafe for any reason. Otherwise, I'll see you at the hearing next week. Ms. Patel, I said as she reached for the door. Thank you for taking this seriously. She paused, turned back, and for the first time since she'd walked in, her expression softened just slightly. Mr. Grant, you activated emergency protocols while bleeding on your living room floor. That tells me everything I need to know about who's telling the truth here. The law is on your side. So am I. After she left, I lay back against the pillows and stared at the pile of documents she'd left for me to review, official and stamped and real in a way that made Miranda's fairy tale look like what it was, a badly written story that nobody with half a brain would believe. The Donahue family had brought memes to a missile fight, and I couldn't wait to watch them learn the difference. Court day arrived with all the pageantry of a dentist appointment that you'd been dreading for weeks, but couldn't cancel because your tooth was literally screaming at you. I woke up in the hotel room that Amira's office had booked for me, because apparently going back to the house where I'd been stabbed was considered a suboptimal choice in legal terms, and stared at the ceiling wondering if this was real life or if I'd somehow wandered into a legal drama written by someone who'd only seen courtrooms on TV and thought they got the gist of it. The federal courthouse was one of those buildings that looked like it had been designed by someone who really wanted you to know that justice was serious business. All imposing columns and granite steps, and the kind of architecture that said, "You will respect the law or the building itself will judge you." I met Amira outside, where she was waiting with another coffee that probably cost more than some people's car payments, looking like she'd been awake since 4 in the morning preparing to destroy people's arguments with facts and logic. "Ready?" she asked, and it wasn't really a question so much as a statement of expectation. As ready as someone can be to watch their in-laws try to convince a federal judge that I stabbed myself for funsies, I said, adjusting my tie with my good arm, while my injured shoulder reminded me that it was still very much an active participant in this drama. The courtroom was exactly what you'd expect. Beige walls that had probably been that color since the Carter administration, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly deceased, and wooden benches that were clearly designed by someone who'd never met a human spine and didn't want to start now. The coffee available in the waiting area was the kind of bad that made you question whether it was actually coffee or just hot water that had been shown a picture of a coffee bean and told to do its best impression. I was sitting on one side with Amira and a federal prosecutor named Jennifer Caldwell, who looked like she ate defense attorneys for breakfast and used their tears as creamer for her coffee. On the other side of the courtroom sat the Donahue family circus. Miranda in a tasteful navy dress that screamed, "I'm a concerned wife and definitely not someone who laughed while her husband was bleeding." Tyler in a suit that looked like he'd borrowed it from someone who'd borrowed it from someone else back in 2003, and Miranda's parents Doug and Cheryl looking like they'd been personally victimized by the concept of consequences. And there, standing at the defense table like he was about to deliver a closing argument in a movie about a scrappy underdog lawyer who wins against all odds, was Rick Blanton in all his billboard glory. His suit was shiny in a way that suggested it was made from materials that had never occurred in nature. His hair was gelled into submission with enough product to waterproof a small boat. And he had this smile that probably looked confident in his bathroom mirror, but in a federal courtroom looked more like he'd realized he'd forgotten to study for the final exam. Tyler caught my eye and smirked at me like we were in on some kind of joke together. Like this was all a big prank show, and any minute someone would jump out with cameras, and we'd all laugh about that time he stabbed me, and I overreacted by involving the federal government. The audacity was actually impressive. This man had literally stabbed me with a screwdriver and was sitting there acting like I was the one being unreasonable for having opinions about it. Miranda looked serene, like she was attending a yoga retreat instead of a federal hearing about her brother assaulting her husband. She had this little smile playing at her lips, the kind of smile you see on people who genuinely believe they're about to win because they've never actually lost before and don't understand that luck eventually runs out. Her eyes met mine for a second, and I saw something in them that might have been pity, like she felt bad that I was putting myself through all this when I could just forgive and forget and go back to being the family punching bag who occasionally got actual punches. The judge walked in. The Honorable Patricia Whitmore, a woman in her 60s who looked like she'd seen every variety of human nonsense and was thoroughly unimpressed by all of it. She had reading glasses perched on her nose, gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and the kind of expression that suggested she'd rather be literally anywhere else, but was going to do her job with the grim determination of someone who took their oath seriously. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and we all stood up like well-trained puppets while Judge Whitmore settled into her chair and surveyed the courtroom with the enthusiasm of someone looking at a pile of paperwork that had personally wronged them. "Please be seated," she said, and her voice had that quality of authority that made you want to sit down quickly and apologize for standing in the first place. We're here for the preliminary hearing in the matter of the United States versus Tyler James Donahue. Case number 24, CR 8847. Let's keep this brief and professional, shall we? Rick Blanton stood up so fast his chair made a scraping noise that echoed through the courtroom like a warning bell that someone was about to say something regrettable. Your Honor, if I may, he began, and I could already tell this was going to be good in the way that watching someone confidently walk into a glass door is good. Mr. Blanton, the judge said, looking at him over her glasses like a teacher who'd already decided this student wasn't going to pass, but was obligated to let him try. You may approach when invited. Until then, please remain seated. Rick sat back down, his confident smile flickering for just a second before he rearranged his face back into what he probably thought was professional determination. Jennifer Caldwell, the federal prosecutor, didn't even look up from her notes, and I could tell she was trying not to smile. Judge Whitmore reviewed the documents in front of her with the kind of methodical attention that suggested she actually read things instead of just skimming them, which was probably bad news for anyone whose case depended on people not reading the actual facts. This is a federal matter involving assault on a federal employee, she said finally. Mr. Caldwell, what does the government wish to present? Jennifer stood up with the smooth confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times and had never lost sleep over any of them. Your Honor, the government has substantial evidence that on October 17th at approximately 3:15 in the morning, the defendant Tyler Donahue did willfully and deliberately assault Mr. Leo Grant, a senior analyst with the Federal Threat Assessment Division, causing bodily harm that required emergency medical intervention. Your Honor, if I may interject, Rick Blanton jumped up again, apparently having learned nothing from 30 seconds ago. This is clearly a family misunderstanding that's been blown completely out of proportion by Mr. Grant's dramatic tendencies. Dramatic tendencies. There it was. The defense strategy was apparently to suggest that I was so dramatic that I'd gotten myself stabbed just to make a point, which was certainly a choice. I leaned over to Amira and whispered, dramatic tendencies. Guess I'm dramatic and stabbed. Talented, right? Amira didn't smile. She was too professional for that, but her pen started moving across her legal pad with the kind of aggressive note-taking that suggested she was documenting everything Rick said for future use in making him look like an idiot. I'd seen enough legal shows to know that when your opponent's lawyer started taking aggressive notes, you were probably about to have a bad time. Mr. Blanton, Judge Whitmore said, and her voice had dropped about 10 degrees in temperature. You will address the court properly and wait to be recognized before speaking. This is not a television show, and I am not interested in dramatic performances. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor, Rick said, and some of that billboard confidence was starting to leak out like air from a tire that had hit a nail called reality. Doug Donahue was shifting uncomfortably in his seat, probably beginning to realize that his son's little mistake was being treated with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for actual crimes, which it was. Cheryl was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, going for the sympathy angle, but Judge Whitmore wasn't even looking at her. Tyler had stopped smirking and was starting to look like maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences come with federal jurisdiction. Miranda was still maintaining that serene expression, but I could see a tiny crack forming in her composure, a little furrow between her eyebrows that suggested the reality that her family couldn't just charm their way out of this one was starting to penetrate the bubble of denial she'd been living in. The judge looked at Rick Blanton with the kind of patience that wasn't actually patience, but was more like the calm before someone gets intellectually demolished. Mr. Blanton, are you suggesting that Mr. Grant, a federal employee with high-level security clearance, deliberately injured himself severely enough to require hospitalization in order to? What exactly? Rick opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish that had just realized it was out of water and nobody was going to throw it back in. To frame my client, Your Honor, family disputes can sometimes. Family disputes, the judge interrupted, do not typically involve screwdrivers embedded in shoulders, Mr. Blanton. But we'll hear the evidence. Ms. Caldwell, please proceed. Jennifer stood up again, and I could see the tiny smile playing at the corner of her mouth, The expression of someone who was about to play their ace card and knew the other side didn't even have a pair of twos. This was going to be good. Jennifer Caldwell opened her briefcase with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested she was about to pull out something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of this hearing. And judging by the way Rick Blanton was suddenly very interested in his own notes, he knew it too. The courtroom had that particular quality of tension you get right before something dramatic happens. Like when you're watching a horror movie and the music gets ominous and you know someone's about to open a door they really shouldn't open. Your Honor, Jennifer said, her voice clear and professional in a way that suggested she'd practiced this in front of a mirror until it was perfect. The government wishes to submit Exhibit A into evidence. Federal Incident Report 88C, classified under Section 7 of the Federal Employee Protection Act. She walked forward and handed a document to the judge, and I watched Judge Whitmore's eyebrows do a slow climb toward her hairline as she looked at the cover page. The document had more official stamps on it than a passport belonging to someone who'd visited every sketchy country in the world twice. And there was a big bold label at the top that read Federal Use Only. Authorized personnel, in letters that practically screamed, "This is serious business, and you should take it seriously." Rick Blanton shot to his feet like someone had lit a fire under his chair. Objection, Your Honor. This document is clearly irrelevant to the matter at hand. We're talking about a simple family dispute, not some kind of federal conspiracy. The way he said federal conspiracy made it sound like he thought the government was out to get his client, which was technically true, but not in the way he meant it. The government wasn't conspiring against Tyler. The government was just accurately documenting that Tyler had committed a felony against one of their employees and was now facing the consequences of that choice. Judge Whitmore looked at Rick over her reading glasses, and I swear the temperature in the courtroom dropped another 10 degrees. Mr. Blanton, I will determine what is and is not relevant in my courtroom. Your objection is overruled. Please sit down before you object yourself into contempt charges. Rick sat down so fast you could hear his cheap suit rustle, and Tyler was looking at his lawyer with an expression that suggested he was beginning to question whether hiring the guy from the billboard had been the brilliant strategic move he'd thought it was at 3 in the morning when they were panic Googling lawyers near me who work weekends. Judge Whitmore began reading the document, and the courtroom went so quiet you could hear Tyler's hangover sweating. I watched Miranda's face as the silence stretched on, saw her confident smile start to waver just a little bit, like she was beginning to suspect that maybe this wasn't going to go the way she'd planned. Doug was gripping Cheryl's hand so tight his knuckles were white, and Cheryl had stopped with the sympathy tears because even she could read the room well enough to know that crying wasn't going to fix whatever was about to happen. The judge read one page, then another, and her expression shifted from professional interest to something that looked like she'd just realized she was dealing with something way bigger than a domestic dispute between a guy and his drunk brother-in-law. She looked up at me, then back down at the document, then up at me again like she was trying to reconcile the guy sitting in her courtroom with whatever she was reading on those pages. Mr. Grant, she said finally, and her voice had taken on a quality of careful respect that hadn't been there before. You work for the Federal Threat Assessment Division? Yes, Your Honor, I said, and I could feel every eye in the courtroom turn to look at me like I'd just announced I was secretly Batman. The judge looked back down at the document, and I could see her reading specific passages, her eyes moving across the page with increasing focus. In what capacity? Senior Threat Analyst, Your Honor. I assess potential security risks to federal infrastructure and personnel. I kept my voice neutral, professional, not mentioning that what I actually did was track down terrorists, analyze threat networks, and occasionally brief people with enough clearance that they had to surrender their phones before walking into the room. But the basics were enough. Jennifer Caldwell, bless her prosecutorial heart, decided this was the perfect moment to drive the point home. Your Honor, if I may direct your attention to page 3, paragraph 2 of the incident report, the timestamp duress signal. Judge Whitmore flipped to page 3, and I watched her read the relevant section. Then she read it again. Then she looked up at Tyler with an expression that suggested she was trying to figure out how someone could be dumb enough to stab a federal analyst and think they'd get away with it. At 0305 hours, the judge read aloud, and her voice had that quality of someone reading something so absurd they had to share it with the class. Duress protocol activated by Senior Threat Analyst Leo Grant via encrypted emergency channel. Signal authenticated and logged through federal security systems. Response team dispatched. Subject reported assault by family member. Specifically, she paused, looked directly at Tyler James Donahue, brother-in-law, who was observed to be intoxicated and violent. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear Miranda's worldview crumbling into dust. Her jaw had actually dropped open, and she was staring at me like I'd just revealed I was a completely different person than the boring government paper pusher she'd married. Which, to be fair, was kind of accurate. Tyler was blinking like someone had just unplugged his brain and was trying to reboot it, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and the dawning realization that he hadn't just stabbed some random guy with a boring desk job. He'd stabbed someone whose job involved things like threat assessment and federal security and protocols that automatically involve the government when activated. Rick Blanton looked like he was having a religious experience, and not the good kind. More like the kind where you realize you've accidentally wandered into a situation way above your pay grade, and all your usual tricks aren't going to work because you've brought a butter knife to a nuclear weapons convention. He was flipping through his own notes frantically, probably trying to find something, anything, that would salvage this situation, but you could tell from his face that he was coming up empty. Doug's mouth was opening and closing like he wanted to say something, but his brain couldn't quite form words anymore. Cheryl had gone pale, the kind of pale you get when you realize your son didn't just get into a bar fight. He committed a federal offense against someone who has the kind of security clearance that comes with automatic protections and protocols. Your Honor, Rick tried weakly, standing up with significantly less confidence than he'd had 5 minutes ago. Surely this is just an administrative formality. My client didn't know. Didn't know what, Mr. Blanton? Judge Whitmore interrupted, and her voice could have frozen lava. Didn't know that stabbing people is illegal? Didn't know that federal employees are protected under federal law? Didn't know that assault is assault regardless of whether the victim works at a coffee shop or for national security? Rick sat back down without answering, which was probably the smartest thing he'd done all day. The judge continued reading, and I could see her getting to the good parts. The part where Miranda had laughed, the part where she tried to convince me it was just a scratch, the part where she'd attempted to coerce me into lying to law enforcement about what happened. All of it was documented, time-stamped, authenticated, and absolutely damning. Ms. Caldwell, the judge said, closing the report and looking at Jennifer with the kind of respect you give someone who's just handed you an airtight case wrapped in a bow. What else does the government wish to present? Your Honor, we also have medical records showing the severity of the injury, forensic analysis proving the wound was inconsistent with any accidental fall, surveillance footage from Mr. Grant's home security system showing the defendant entering the residence in an intoxicated state, and testimony from the emergency responders who treated Mr. Grant at the scene. Jennifer was ticking items off on her fingers like she was reading a shopping list, except instead of groceries, it was evidence that was about to bury Tyler's defense so deep it would need archaeological excavation to find it. Home security system. I'd installed cameras 6 months ago after my laptop had mysteriously disappeared during one of Tyler's visits, and then reappeared a week later with a cracked screen and a browser history full of used car listing sites. The cameras had been a precaution, a just-in-case measure that I'd honestly hoped I'd never need. Turns out, future me had really appreciated past me's paranoia. Miranda's face had gone from confused to horrified as she realized that not only had I documented everything through federal channels, but there was also video evidence. Video evidence of Tyler stumbling into our house drunk. Video evidence of him grabbing the screwdriver. Video evidence of everything that contradicted the fairy tale she tried to spin about me tripping over my own feet. Tyler had stopped blinking and was now just staring straight ahead with the expression of someone who'd just realized they'd made a series of catastrophic decisions and there was no undo button. The smirk was completely gone, replaced by something that looked like the early stages of panic mixed with the late stages of denial. Judge Whitmore set the report down on her desk with a finality that sounded like a gavel hitting wood. Mr. Blanton, does your client wish to change his plea at this time? Rick looked at Tyler, and Tyler looked at Rick, and there was a whole silent conversation happening between them that basically amounted to, "We are so screwed, and I paid you money for this." We We'd like to request a continuance, Your Honor, to review this new evidence. Rick stammered. New evidence. The judge's eyebrow raised. Mr. Blanton, this evidence has been available since the incident occurred. The fact that you failed to do adequate research before walking into my courtroom is not grounds for a continuance. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the sound of Rick Blanton's billboard career dying a slow death in a federal courthouse. The judge looked at me, and there was something in her expression that might have been approval or might have been pity. I wasn't sure which. Mr. Grant, do you have anything you'd like to add? No, Your Honor, I said. I think the evidence speaks for itself. And boy, did it ever. Judge Whitmore spent about 30 seconds reviewing the documents in front of her, which in courtroom time is basically the equivalent of an eternity where everyone holds their breath and wonders if they're about to witness justice or a miscarriage thereof. The silence was so thick you could cut it with a knife, or in this case, maybe a screwdriver, since that seemed to be the weapon of choice in my family drama. Rick Blanton was sweating in a way that suggested his deodorant had given up around the same time his legal strategy had, and Tyler was doing this thing where he kept looking at the door, like maybe if he stared at it hard enough, it would turn into a magical escape portal. The judge looked up from the documents, removed her reading glasses with the kind of deliberate slowness that meant she was about to say something that would ruin someone's whole year, and fixed Tyler with a stare that could have melted steel. Mr. Donahue, she said, and her voice had all the warmth of a walk-in freezer in January. This court has reviewed the federal incident report, the medical documentation, the forensic analysis, and the security footage. The evidence is overwhelming and frankly disturbing. Tyler opened his mouth like he was going to say something, probably something along the lines of, but it was an accident, or he's being dramatic, or one of the other greatest hits from the Donahue family playbook of denial. But his lawyer grabbed his arm and yanked him back down into his seat with the kind of force that suggested Rick had finally realized that letting his client speak would be like throwing gasoline on a fire that was already consuming their case. The evidence verifies a deliberate assault on a federal employee, Judge Whitmore continued, and each word was dropping like a hammer on Tyler's future. This is not a family misunderstanding, as the defense has attempted to characterize it. This is a violent crime with clear intent, documented through multiple channels and authenticated by federal security protocols. She picked up a form that I recognized as a restraining order. I'd seen enough of them during my work analyzing domestic extremist cases to know what they looked like, and began filling it out with decisive pen strokes that sounded loud in the quiet courtroom. I am issuing a permanent restraining order effective immediately. Mr. Donahue, you are not to come within 500 feet of Mr. Grant, his residence, his place of employment, or any federal facility. You are not to contact him directly or indirectly through any means, phone, email, social media, carrier pigeon. I don't care if you train a parrot to deliver messages, you will not contact him. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling because a federal judge had just made a joke about parrots in the middle of destroying my brother-in-law's life, and it was possibly the best moment I'd had since before I got stabbed. Furthermore, the judge continued, and you could tell she was just getting warmed up, I am recommending that the federal prosecutor's office pursue felony charges for assault on a federal employee under 18 U.S. Code Section 111. This carries a maximum sentence of 8 years in federal prison. 8 years. The number hung in the air like a bomb that had just been dropped and was waiting to explode. Tyler's face went through about 17 different emotions in 3 seconds. Shock, denial, anger, fear, and finally landing on something that looked like he might actually cry or throw up or both simultaneously. Doug Donahue made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a wheeze, like someone had punched him in the solar plexus. Cheryl's hand flew to her mouth, and the tears that came now weren't the manipulative sympathy tears from earlier. These were genuine, oh God, what have we done tears. Miranda was staring at the judge like she couldn't quite process what was happening, like her brain was trying to load a page, but the internet was down and everything was just buffering endlessly. Your Honor, please. Rick Blanton stood up one more time, and you had to give the guy credit for persistence even if you couldn't give him credit for competence. Surely we can work out some kind of arrangement. My client is a productive member of society with no prior record. Your client, Judge Whitmore interrupted, and the way she said, your client, made it sound like she was talking about a particularly disappointing science experiment. stabbed a federal analyst who works in national security. The fact that he managed to avoid getting arrested before this does not make him a productive member of society. It makes him lucky. That luck has now run out. She signed the restraining order with a flourish that looked almost theatrical, stamped it with her official seal, and handed it to the bailiff. "Bailiff, please serve Mr. Donahue with this order and escort him from the courthouse. He is to leave immediately and remain compliant with all terms outlined in this document." The bailiff, a guy in his 40s who looked like he'd seen every variety of courtroom drama and was profoundly bored by all of it, walked over to Tyler with the restraining order. Tyler took it with hands that were shaking, and for the first time since I'd known him, for the first time in 2 years of his swagger and his bragging and his condescending comments about my little government job, he looked small. He looked like what he actually was, a 32-year-old used car salesman who'd made a catastrophically stupid decision while drunk and was now discovering that actions have consequences even if your family usually protects you from them. "This is bullshit," Tyler muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, because apparently he decided that what this situation really needed was him making it worse. "Excuse me." Judge Whitmore's voice could have frozen nitrogen. "Mr. Donahue, would you like to add contempt of court to your growing list of legal problems?" Tyler looked at his lawyer, who was shaking his head so frantically he looked like a bobblehead on a dashboard during an earthquake. "No, Your Honor," Tyler said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Then I suggest you leave my courtroom with what dignity you have remaining, which based on your behavior is approximately none." The judge turned to the bailiff. "Escort Mr. Donahue out. If he resists or makes any further comments, you have my permission to arrest him for contempt." The bailiff put a hand on Tyler's shoulder, not rough, just firm enough to make it clear this wasn't a suggestion, and started walking him toward the door. Tyler shot me a look as he passed, and there was so much hate in his eyes that if looks could kill, I'd have been dead 3 times over. But hate doesn't hold up well in federal court, and his look bounced off me like water off a duck's back because I was too busy feeling vindicated to care about his feelings. Doug and Cheryl were following Tyler like mourners at a funeral, which in a way I guess they were. They were mourning the death of the fantasy that their son was special and above consequences. Doug kept trying to make eye contact with me, probably looking for some sign that I'd be merciful or that we could work this out like family, but I looked right through him like he was made of glass. Cheryl was crying openly now, mascara running down her face in dark streaks that made her look like a sad raccoon, but I felt about as much sympathy for her as she'd shown me at all those barbecues where I'd been the family punching bag. As they reached the door, Miranda finally seemed to shake herself out of her shocked stupor. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made everyone look at her, and she started moving toward me with purpose. "Leo, wait," she called out, and her voice was desperate in a way I'd never heard before, like she was finally realizing that maybe laughing while your husband bleeds isn't a great foundation for a marriage. "Leo, please, we need to talk about this. This is crazy. He's family. We can work this out." She was maybe 10 feet away when Amira Patel stepped smoothly into her path like a professional bodyguard who'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Mrs. Grant," Amira said, and her voice was pleasant in the way that a restraining order is pleasant, polite on the surface, but absolutely not to be messed with. "That's close enough. I need to talk to my husband," Miranda said, and she was going for assertive, but it came out more like pleading. Mascara was starting to smudge under her eyes, her perfect composure finally cracking like ice on a pond in spring. "Your husband," Amira replied, adjusting her briefcase like she was preparing to use it as a weapon if necessary, "has made it clear through his legal representation, that's me, in case you're confused, that he does not wish to speak with you at this time. Any further attempts to contact him may be construed as witness intimidation, which I'm sure you're aware is also a federal crime." Miranda looked at me over Amira's shoulder, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been genuine regret or might have been regret that she got caught. I honestly couldn't tell anymore and didn't particularly care. "Leo, come on. This is ridiculous. We can fix this. Tyler made a mistake, but he's sorry. You don't have to do this." I stood up, my shoulder protesting the movement, but I ignored it because some things are worth a little pain, and I looked at my wife, or soon-to-be ex-wife if my lawyers had anything to say about it, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, Just the kind of peaceful emptiness you get when you finally stop caring about something that's been weighing you down for way too long. Miranda, I said, and my voice was calm, steady, the voice I used when briefing senators on terrorist threats. You watched your brother stab me, and you laughed. You tried to gaslight me into lying to the police. You hired a lawyer to paint me as mentally unstable. I don't think we have anything left to talk about. But, she started. That's all, Mrs. Grant, Amira interrupted, physically positioning herself between us like a very professional wall. Please exit the courtroom before I ask the bailiff to escort you out as well. For a moment, I thought Miranda might actually argue, might try to push past Amira, or make a scene, or do something dramatic that would perfectly cap off this whole ridiculous situation. But something in Amira's expression, or maybe it was the bailiff taking a step in her direction, made her back down. She grabbed her purse, shot me one more look that was part pleading and part accusation, like I was the one who'd ruined everything instead of just being the one who'd finally stopped letting myself get ruined. And she walked out of the courtroom with her head high and her dignity in tatters. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the ending of a chapter in a book I was really glad to be done reading. Judge Whitmore was watching me with an expression that might have been approval or might have been pity. Mr. Grant, the court apologizes that you had to endure this situation. No federal employee should face violence from family members or anyone else. Thank you, Your Honor, I said, and I meant it. She nodded, gathered her papers, and stood. The preliminary hearing is concluded. The federal prosecutor's office will be in touch regarding the formal charges against Mr. Donahue. Court is adjourned. As everyone started filing out, I just stood there for a moment, letting it all sink in. For the first time in 2 years, maybe longer, I felt like I could breathe. A year later, I had a new scar and a better title, Team Lead, Federal Threat Analysis Division. Turns out getting stabbed by your brother-in-law and handling it with federal precision looks great on a performance review. Who knew that documenting your own assault could be a career boost? My office had bulletproof glass, which felt excessive until I remembered that my previous living situation had involved surprise screwdriver attacks at 3 in the morning. Compared to that, bulletproof glass seemed downright reasonable. The coffee machine was one of those fancy ones that ground fresh beans and didn't judge me for my life choices, which already made it better company than my ex-wife. My new crew was actually functional, which was a refreshing change. There was Nate, a cybersecurity specialist who could hack a toaster if you gave him 5 minutes and proper motivation. Lydia handled linguistic analysis and could tell you someone's hometown from a 3-word text message, which was either impressive or terrifying, depending on how you felt about privacy. And Ben was our optimist, the guy who genuinely believed in the good of humanity despite spending 40 hours a week analyzing threats to national security. We had this running joke that my scar looked like a USB port for bad memories, which was both accurate and oddly comforting. Sometimes I'd see headlines about family feuds turning violent, and I'd mutter amateurs while sipping my perfectly brewed coffee. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago. Miranda got the couch she'd spent so much time scrolling TikTok on, and I got my dignity back. Seemed like a fair trade. Tyler was serving 18 months in federal prison after taking a plea deal. Rick Blanton had probably retired from law to pursue a career in something less demanding, like underwater basket weaving. And me? I was finally breathing easy. One night, about 14 months after the screwdriver incident that had fundamentally reorganized my life in ways that were mostly positive and occasionally hilarious, I was sitting in my apartment, not our apartment, a distinction that still gave me a little thrill every time I thought about it, working through some threat assessments when my personal email pinged. The sender name made me do a double take, Miranda Grant. Except she wasn't Miranda Grant anymore. Or at least I hoped she'd figured out how to change her email signature, because the divorce had been finalized half a year ago, and holding on to your ex-husband's last name felt like the kind of move someone makes when they're still in denial about how thoroughly they torpedoed their marriage. I stared at the email for a solid 30 seconds, debating whether opening it was going to ruin my perfectly good evening or provide entertainment. Curiosity won, because apparently I'm the kind of person who pokes at emotional bruises just to see if they still hurt. The subject line read, "Can we talk?" Spoiler alert, we could not. I opened it anyway, because I'm only human and humans are notoriously bad at leaving well enough alone. The email was long, like multi-paragraph long, and started with, "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from," which was accurate enough that I almost gave her points for self-awareness. Almost. She wrote about regret, about how she'd had time to think about everything that happened, about how she understood now that she'd made mistakes. She claimed she didn't realize how serious Tyler's drinking problem was, which was interesting considering he'd been drunk at approximately 70% of all family gatherings I'd attended. She said the whole situation had been a misunderstanding and that Tyler's life was ruined because of the felony conviction, as if his life being ruined was somehow my fault and not the natural consequence of him stabbing a federal employee. The email ended with the question I'd been expecting since paragraph 1. Could I ever forgive her? I sat there, cursor hovering over the reply button, and a year ago, hell, 6 months ago, I might have typed something. Maybe something angry, or something explaining exactly why forgiveness wasn't on the menu, or something that would make her understand the depth of the betrayal. But now, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, not even satisfaction. Just a profound sense of this is no longer my problem. I hit archive. Not delete, archive. Because someday, maybe when I'm old and gray and telling stories to people who think my scar is from something cooler than family drama, I might want to look back at this email and remember what it felt like to finally, completely, stop caring. No anger, no tears, just peace, and a faint chuckle at the audacity of thinking a few paragraphs could undo what she'd done. Because while Miranda was busy rewriting history in her head, trying to make herself the victim of circumstances instead of the architect of consequences, I was busy protecting actual history. My team had just disrupted a cyber threat that could have compromised infrastructure in 3 states. I was doing work that mattered, with people who respected me, in an office with bulletproof glass and coffee that didn't taste like regret. And that judge's face when she'd read the federal incident report? Still my favorite punchline.